Shalom, Bruchim Habayim, and welcome to Shevaim Panim LaTorah, to 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayeishev, which in Hebrew means, and he settled, or and he returned, which is a reference to Yaakov Avinu, that upon returning back to Eretz HaKodesh, after being in exile for about 21 years with his uncle Lavan, or Laban as he's known in English, he returns and he settles in the land of his fathers. That is the land of Avraham and the land of Yitzhak. The primary focus of Vayeishev, most people know, is without a shadow of a doubt, is dealing with the story of Yosef. Yosef being, at this point in time, the youngest son of Yaakov, but we know that the final child that he has with Rachel would be Benjamin or Benjamin. And so the Torah is fixated with Yaakov and Yosef pretty much. It goes right into the genealogy of dealing with Yaakov's descendants by focusing on Yosef. And then we know that because of that, there is a animosity between Yosef and his brothers in which they plot against him, conspire against him, originally wanting to do harm to him, and then they sell him. And he goes to Mitzrayim, where he's going to spend a good duration of his life, where he is essentially imprisoned, first as a servant to Potiphar, and then later he is thrown into an Egyptian prison because Potiphar's wife lied against him, saying that he attempted to rape her. And what we also read in Parashat Vayeishev is some interesting detail about Yehuda, who is the ringleader behind this whole episode of conspiring against Yosef, and essentially because of his remorse for what he did, not only to his youngest brother, but also to his father, betraying his trust. The Torah mentions how Yehuda then turns his focus and he goes down amongst the inhabitants of the Canaanites, which is a prohibition. Hashem told Abraham that he and his descendants were not to commingle with any of the inhabitants of the 7 Canaanite nations. And so Yehuda does just that. He goes and takes a woman as a wife named Shua, has 3 children with him, Onan, and then Shelah. The first 2 child die, and then the last one, Shelah, out of concern that he would not also suffer the same fate, eventually keeps him away from marrying the daughter-in-law, which we know as Tamar. And so that concept of passing on a surviving brother to the succeeding wife, the surviving wife of the deceased, in Hebrew is called Yibum, or what we would translate as levirate marriage. And there's a lot of interesting detail that we go into about that, but we're not going to talk about that for today. Rather, today's subject is going to be focusing on something called the remedy. And when we take a look at a lot of the information in this Torah portion, we find some things that are perplexing, some things that are very disturbing. Once again, the primary focus on this Torah portion is really Mikirat Yosef, or what we call the sale of Joseph. And the Torah, the Parashat then interrupts after the sale of Yosef to go focus on Yehuda and his descent to amongst the Canaanites. And then after that episode, it returns back to focusing on the life of Yosef, where he would later be thrown into prison because he was falsely accused by the wife of Potiphar. Now, when you take a look at these 2 narratives, their juxtaposition, Mikirat Yosef and the descent of Yehuda, do they have something in common? Is one story an outgrowth of the other? Now, when you step back and you look at this entire Torah portion from a bird's eye view, and you really probe it from all the angles, there's something that's a little disturbing. And what do I mean? It's the shocking silence of Hashem. In other words, Hashem does not intervene when Yosef's brothers conspire against him, when they seek to betray him, even when they seek to murder him, because in their minds, they perceive their youngest brother, the son of Rachel, as a Navi Sheker, a false prophet to some degree. And so we see Hashem does not speak to Yaakov, does not speak to any of Yaakov's children. Absolutely silent. And the question is why? Why would God be silent in this whole ordeal? Now, from a rabbinical perspective, usually there's an interesting comparison when you look at the genealogy of the descendants of Israel. When you look at Avraham, Avraham was married to Sarah. He desired to have his own child, which eventually would be Yitzhak. However, in the interim of waiting for Yitzhak to manifest, we see that he had relations with Sarah's shifcha, or maidservant, which was Hagar. And that was only because Sarah permitted it to happen. And the result of that union was the birth of Ishmael. However, even though Ishmael is biologically Abraham's son, he's not legally Abraham's son. What do I mean is that because Hagar was the maidservant to Sarah, meaning that was her property. I hate to sound so vague and coarse about that term, as if like, Hagar was just a piece of nothing, like property, that's it. But in Jewish law, that's what is considered. A maidservant, a servant, they're considered somewhat acquisitions, okay, of a part of one's property that they have, whether that's livestock, etc. And so basically the child that was born from that union would also belong to Sarah. So when you look at the comparison, Abraham had a Yitzhak, he had an Ishmael. Then later on, when Yitzhak married to Rivka and they had children, you had a Yaakov and you had an Esav. And so now as we go down the line with Yaakov, Yaakov did not have an Esav. He did not have a Ishmael, right? He had 12 sons and 1 daughter. And so here we have the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, the righteous children of Yaakov. And yet, in the midst of that, we see this bitter hatred, the sinach chinam, that is actually marinating under the surface here between these individuals. And this also captures the rabbinical concept that is known, or the adium that is actually known, the adage, I should say, Maaseh Avot Simin Labanim, which translates roughly as the actions of the fathers, they become a sign for the children. So the concept of sinach chinam, baseless hatred, that was the underlying cause for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, okay, rooted in Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, actually originates from the actions between Yosef's brothers and how they mistreated him. And so when you look at this entire ordeal in this narrative, why is it that God is quiet? Why did Hashem not intervene? It also brings up an interesting discussion regarding what's called bechira, or free will. Does a person have a right, a true free will, to act against another person? In this case, if we look at the children of Yaakov and we say, oh, they were allegedly all Siddiqim, right? Was the children of Leah, etc., were they correct in their judging of their younger brother, the son of Rachel, thinking that he was a false prophet and that they wanted to actually silence him and they wanted to kill him? So why would Hashem allow the progenitors of Israel to act in such what we would perceive as a barbaric or uncivilized manner? Why? Why allow that to happen, right? And we know that through the narrative, eventually it is Ruvain and his advice that he advises his brothers, listen, let's not actually kill him, right? Because if he's truly a false prophet, right, truly a false prophet, then the heavenly court will see to it that he is judged. And so the idea with Ruvain was, we'll throw him into a bore, into an empty pit, right? And any type of wild insects, scorpions, poisonous snakes that are there, they would afflict him. And if he's not in Avi Sheker, right, then they won't cause him any harm. It's very similar to the concept of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den by Nebuchadnezzar because he refused to bow, which is a form of avodah zarah or idolatry. And so instead of the lions actually feasting upon him, the lions actually yielded to him. Okay, so in this concept, we know eventually that Ruvain, or Yosef, was not touched. He was not afflicted. He was not killed, Baruch Hashem, but he was eventually trafficked. He was sold, okay, down to Mitzrayim. And what's interesting, according to Chazal, is that the money, the proceeds that the brothers took from selling Yosef, they went and bought a pair of sneakers, sandals, right? Crazy, but that's actually what they did. And the prophets speak about this as well, about the transaction of a human soul for a pair of footwear. And so when we look at this, we ask, why did God not intervene, right? Why is Hashem silent on this whole ordeal? And then eventually Yehuda is greatly depressed because of his actions. He goes down. And that's a whole, like I said, another story within itself, a mind-blowing lesson, because we learn so many different things. One, we see that because he commingled, he became unequally yoked with a weaker vessel, a weaker spiritual vessel. In other words, this woman Shua that he had relations with and eventually had 3 children with, she was of a lower dargah spiritual level as a Canaanite. And therefore, the souls that were fused into these children, Onan, and then eventually Shelah, they were spiritually defective, okay? And because of that, the first 2 boys, they die. And it's very interesting, if you look at the name in Hebrew, reverse spell it spells Ra. And it says that they both did Ra, evil in the eyes of Hashem. And so they were not have been able to continue the Abrahamic legacy regardless if they would have remained alive. And so what we see that Hashem allowed, he orchestrated, which once again, it doesn't mention Vayedaber Adonai, God speaking, but the Torah describes that in spite of what happened to her, Tamar not being able to marry the youngest son that was left, Shelah, she dresses herself up as a zona, a prostitute, and basically deceives her father-in-law. And yet the Torah indicates that Yehuda himself was detoured, was pulled away, was attracted to that direction to go and seek out sexual services from his so-called daughter-in-law. And yet that whole event that transpired, God says nothing, and yet the result of that is the narrative of the twins Zerach and Peretz that are born. And that's significant because Peretz is the line that later Ruta Moavia would be married into. And on a side note, it's interesting when we talk about concepts like Mashiach, Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. You don't refer to Mashiach as Mashiach ben Yehuda, but Mashiach ben David. Why is that? Because of this blemish, this pagam that was in Yehuda. And so really his descent into Canaan amongst the Canaanites was all to be a catalyst for his ascent out, eventually with the interaction he had with Tamar. And so when we look at all this, we're baffled because God is silent. He's not speaking, there's no intervention, things are naturally taking their course, but yet the divine fingerprint of the Creator is involved. And that really leads me to the point of what I want to share here today. Because while the outcome of the sale of Yosef led him to being later established as what we consider the Prince of Mitzrayim, second to Paro, we have to ask the question, why is it that Yosef had to undergo such a dramatic and traumatic experience to reach the heights of success? Now, I'm not saying success in the sense of how the world measures success, like a person, rises to like a Fortune 500 company or a political position or whatever the case may be, and it's measured success in the form of a secular definition. Because the impact of Yosef's power was ultimately to raise the consciousness of the people towards the Creator, in which they were also getting ready to face an existential crisis with the famine. So his role was very critical and pivotal in directing the consciousness of the people to the Creator. So when we look at this and we ask, why did this happen? Why did that happen? The Midrash comes along and attempts to offer an answer by explaining that Hashem used all of those unfortunate events that had befallen Yaakov and his family to simply engineer the coming of the Mashiach. We read here in the Midrash of Breshit Rabbah 85:1. It says over here, V'Yosef haya asuk b'shakho, that while Yosef, Ruvain, and Yaakov, they were mourning their part in the fate that had befallen each other. It also mentions Yehuda haya asuk likach lo isha, and Yehuda was busy choosing a wife. That's when he went down amongst the Canaanites and took the woman Shua. Well, all this is going on. The Midrash says v'hakadosh baruch hu haya osek borei oro shel melech hamashiach. The Holy One, blessed be He, on the other hand, was occupied with creating the light of King Messiah. Now, this is a very interesting midrash, but what does it mean on the practical level? In other words, how did the betrayal, the sale of Yosef, the descent of Yehuda, the mourning and depression of Yaakov, how did all that serve as a catalyst for the coming of the Mashiach? So the Gemara Masechet Megillah attempts to offer an answer by explaining that before Hashem causes us to experience any affliction in this world, any tribulation, He has already prepared the remedy. We read here Masechet Megillah 13b, Amar Rava Achar Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Refuah Lamaka. The Holy One, blessed be He, created a remedy for the affliction. The Amar Reish Lakish said over here, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu makeh et Israel eli in kein borei lahen refuah techila. That the Holy One, blessed be He, does not smite, does not afflict Israel unless He has created a remedy for them beforehand. Shnei Amar, as it says here in Hosea, chapter 7, verse 1, which says, when I heal Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim will be revealed. Meaning that Israel will be punished once Hashem has created their healing. Very interesting. This statement by Chazal is actually, if you can see from the headliner, Masechet Megillah, is actually based on Megillat Esther. And basically, we know from the Megillah, Esther was established to become the queen. She took the place of Vashti, which was the original wife of Achashverosh, or what some call Xerxes. Once Esther became the queen, that is when Hashem allowed the wicked Haman to come to power. And so while Israel was faced with a great threat, it was Esther who foiled Haman's conspiracy to attempt to commit a mass genocide upon the Jewish people. The concept or the idea behind this concept of Hashem creating the remedy before the affliction is to instill into a person the power of emunah and bitachon, faith and trust. In other words, the very salvation, the remedy that a person is looking for, is desiring, is yearning for, has already been created. It just hasn't concretized into this space-time fabric of existence yet. A person needs to learn to tap into the proper frequency to manifest it. And when I say the frequency, I'm not trying to sound like some new age idiot. I'm talking about being on the same line of communication with Hashem. We find proof to this concept with the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Back in Parashat Vayeishev, the Torah tells us that once Sarah told Abraham to remove the maidservant and the son because of the opposition and conflict that was happening, especially in light of the birth of Yitzhak, to cast him out, and Hashem told Abraham that he needed to listen to the voice of his wife. The Torah tells us that both Hagar and Ishmael are in the wilderness and there's no water. There's a lack of water. And so Hagar became extremely worried that her child was going to die. And so in response to Hagar's worry, the Torah tells us that Hashem opened her eyes to a source of water that was always there, but she had no knowledge of it. We read here in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 21, verse 15 through 19. It says, when the water of the skins was consumed, so like a water flask. It says afterwards, V'tashlek et hayeled tachad achad, hasichim. She then cast the boy off beneath one of the trees. She went and sat down at a distance, some feet away, and she says, Amara el a'e b'mot hayelet, let me not see the death of the child. Not now, it should say, let me not. It's a typo on my behalf, I apologize. And so it says, she sat at a distance, and afterwards, vatisa et kola vatevech. She then lifted her voice and began to cry. It goes on to say, Vayishma Elohim et Cho HaNa'ar. God heard the voice of the child, the youth, meaning the cries of Ishmael, which ultimately what his name means in Hebrew, Ishmael means God hears. Vayichra Malach Elohim et El Hagar. And so an angel of God called out to Hagar ben Hashemayim from heaven, Vayomer La, and said to her, Malach Hagar el Tiri'i ki Shema Elohim el Cho HaNa'ar. Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the youth in Ba'asher Hu Sham, his present state, exactly where he's at. Kumi si'i et hana'ar, arise, lift up the youth, v'hachaziki et yadech, and place your hand upon him. Ki legoy gadol asimenu, for I will make him a great nation. Then the Torah goes on to say, Vayichach Elohim et eneha v'tere be'er mayim. Then God opened her eyes, and she perceived a well. Vatelek vatimale. She went and she filled et hachemet, the skin, mayim, with water, and gave the youth to drink. Now I want you to pay attention to what the Torah says. The Torah did not say here that Hashem created a well of water. He produced a well of water. Rather, that Hashem opened the eyes of Hagar to the well of water. Vayivchach Elohim et eneha. In other words, he revealed to her the water that was already in existence, the water that she was in need for, that she was crying out for her child who was very thirsty and could die of dehydration. The water was there. She had no knowledge of it. It already was there. Commenting on this, the Midrash brings out a very fascinating statement. This is Bereshit Rabbah 53:14. Amar Rabbi Binyamin, he says, Hako becheskak sumin shehakadosh baruch hu me'ir et enehem. All humans are in a state of being blind people until the Holy One, blessed be He, enlightens their eyes, opens their eyes. Fascinating. How could it be that Hagar was blinded to this alleged well of water? Well, the Midrash just mentioned to us that all of us are blinded to the things we need until Hashem enlightens our eyes. Me'ir et enehem. A spiritual principle is being taught here. And what is being taught is that whatever we have is given to us by Hashem. Not everything we achieve in this world is from the result of just working hard, difficult labor, or working with our hands, or being, socially motivated to connect and network with people. No. Rather, through the power of our faith and trust in Hashem, we can manifest the blessings of God into our lives. Now, I have taught and I've demonstrated in many teachings before that everything we need already exists in the quantum field. Everything. It exists in the quantum field. The process of the things we need to manifest from the immaterial to the material depends on the energy we harness. And what is that energy? Emunah and bitachon. Faith and trust. Matter is an illusion, and that has been proven from a physics standpoint. Matter is an illusion that is a cast over our sensory perception. Most of reality is concealed from our five senses. Our senses appear to tell us unequivocally that we live in a solid and enduring reality of matter, right? You hit the safe for this book, this table, it seems solid. But that's because the atoms, the atomic makeup of these physical items, the density slows down and it creates the illusion of what we call matter. It's a part of the Creator's greater scheme of creation and how He oversees everything, and why we had to materialize in this lower dimension, especially after the violation of Adam and Chava in Gad Eden, which is really another dimension, another reality outside of this one. And so our senses are extremely limited. Our eyes, for example, detect only visible light, a very tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum That also includes radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays, none of which we can perceive through our sense of sight. Yes, we can develop scientific instruments and technological advancement of those instruments to study those various forms of lights, but we cannot perceive them from our naked eye. And so if our sense of sight was not limited to, let's say, only seeing the narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum, we would be able to see the rest of that spectrum, meaning we will be able to perceive a world that is entirely made up of light, which is exactly how the Torah describes all of creation back in Genesis 1. So imagine for a second that there be thousands of colors, not just the 7 colors of the visible light spectrum that we know with the rainbow. And that spectrum is a luminous reality. Likewise, when it comes to our ears can detect sounds that vibrate anywhere between 20 to 20,000 hertz. However, sounds can vibrate at frequencies well beyond 20,000 hertz. Even, for example, bats, right? Bats can detect sounds as high as 200,000 hertz. Atoms vibrate at frequencies as high as 10 trillion hertz. The lower range of sound, known as infrared sound, vibrates as slow as 0.001 hertz. Sources of such low frequency sounds are earthquakes, volcanoes, and thunderclaps. And so if our sense of hearing was not limited to our ears' narrow band of detection, we would experience a world bursting with sound from the powerful pulse of the movement of all creation, the continuous vibration of atoms. And so matter is nothing more than a light show illusion made of vibrating energy. The visible world is the invisible organization of energy. Science has discovered that our third eye, which is known as our pineal gland, is really not a gland. The pineal gland contains light-sensitive photoreceptor cells. These cells play an important role in the regulation of our circadian rhythm and our physiology. Science has learned that the pineal receptor, the photoreceptor cells, share great homologies with retinal photoreceptor cells, such as cell morphology, the expression of opsine proteins, and the response to light stimuli. The pineal photoreceptor cells function autonomously with strong rhythmic patterns. And science has recently learned that the calcite structures of the pineal gland contain a piezoelectric properties. And so in layman's terms, what this means is that when pressure is applied to these structures, they produce an electrical charge. This property makes it an antenna for our brain that receives signals and adapts to energy. If anybody's ever studied the life of Nikola Tesla, for example, one of the things that Nikola Tesla testified in his writings is that his brain acted as a receiver, that he would download information from the creator, from the universe, and suddenly he would be able to have these ideas, visions, and he would start to map them out, and then he would go and put things into practice. And obviously, tragically, his life was not well praised and respected because much of his information was confiscated by government agencies and then falsely attributed to other individuals. But he testified that his brain was simply a receiver, picking up information, downloading into his soul. So another property of these crystals is that they act as a transducer, which means they can convert the energy received into another form in its irregular work form. And so this is what allows the third eye to function as a gateway between the upper and lower world. And so in practice, the piezoelectric effect works with the tiny crystals surrounding the pineal gland surface through the pulse of energy of piezochromatism, chromomatic, tongue twisted there, piezochromatism. And so piezochromatic crystals are simply crystals that can release any color of light in the rainbow. This experience is achieved through breathing and meditative exercise that release the cerebrospinal fluid, which is pushed against the pineal gland. This results in a release of an electrical charge that expands the calcite crystals around the pineal, which in turn creates a constant electromagnetic field within our brains. And so this is exactly the consecration level of many of the Nevi'im, the prophets, that when they will undergo a certain fast, dry fast, no water, no food. Also, semen retention is a big thing. In Judaism, there's a negative view on what's called spilling seed. A lot of that is also an effect as well, because it depends on a person's consecration, that they will not deviate being led by the lust of their eyes or their ego. Okay, that deals with the forces of Tumah, impure energy. So when a person undergoes this meditative practice, okay, and for those who are not familiar, we have concepts like meditation, like here in my Steiner, taken from Sefer Yehoshua, the book of Joshua. One of the things Hashem told Joshua that after he succeeded Moshe, v'hagit bo yomam v'layla, you shall meditate in it day and night. That is the actual command Hashem told Yehoshua. Meditate upon these things. Think upon them, right? Visualize within them. In other words, not just self-egocentric visualization that the world promotes, which is maybe somebody wants to become rich and famous. This is all done through the Creator, through the commandments of the Torah. It's being utilized in order to be as a co-creator, a co-partner with Hashem, and fulfilling the divine will of God. So when we learn to properly tap into the power of faith and trust, emunah betachon, this is where we learn to manifest the immaterial and incorporeal things of Hashem. And so, like the story of Hagar, the water already existed. Hagar simply needed to tune into the proper frequency and trust Hashem. Likewise, everything that we need, we have a need of, it already exists. The problem is when people lack emunah betachon, they have to ask 1,000 questions. What if this? What if that? Why this? Why that? I don't see how this will happen. And so they don't throw their brains out the window. They simply try to problem solve. They try to have logic in the situation because they're faced with a certain situation, an existential crisis, whatever it may be. And they're looking at what they have and they don't have X amount of dollars in their bank account. They don't have the youthful vitality they once had. Maybe they're dealing with a health issue. So they're looking at this and they figure, like, I don't see how this is going to work. Well, that's where emunah is faith, but betachon, betach is trust. Trust means that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is going to do something for you, even though you do not have any results. You don't see an actual solution right now, but you have blind faith in Hashem. So Hashem has already created the remedy. Our thoughts and actions determine when we will experience God's blessing. And so when we go through our tribulation, we go through an affliction, that is because Hashem has already created a remedy for us. And as we learned from Chazal earlier, Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu refuah lamaka, before God allows us to experience any tribulation, He has already created the remedy. Before Haman could rise to power, Esther first had to be established as the queen. And so Israel is not exempt from experiencing any tribulation. They were not exempt from facing a massive genocide in the days of Haman. Their lives were on the line. And yet Hashem was silent. He did not speak the entire time in the Megillah. And so ultimately Israel's thoughts and actions would determine the outcome. Very similar to the events in Parashat Vayeishev. God is silent. He's not saying anything. But everything is being engineered for the divine plan to come to fruition. The Midrash comments that Israel's cause of salvation from Mitzrayim was simply from Yosef. Yosef himself. We read here in Bereshit Rabbah 84:5. It says, Mi moridan le Mitzrayim. Who brought the family down to Mitzrayim? Yosef. Okay. Mi mechachilan. Okay, and who sustained them? Yosef. Hayam lo nichra ele bezukhoto shel Yosef. And the Yam, the sea, later when Israel with Moshe fled and they went across the Yam Suf, The Yam Suf split only in the Zechut, the merit of Yosef, Hadalhu Diktiv, as it's written in Psalm chapter 77, verse 17. It says, Ra'ucha mayim elokim, ra'ucha mayim yachilu. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you and were terrified. Cross-reference this midrash with Bereshit Rabbah 87:8. Also commenting on the same feature, it says, Bizuchut atzmotav shel Yosef nichra hayam li Israel. In the merit of Yosef's bones, the Yam split for Israel. As is written in Psalm chapter 114, verse 3, which is in the Hallel, hayam ra'ah vayanos bizuchut vayazov bigdo biyada vayanas. The sea saw and it fled. It's done in the merit of Yosef, because it says in Genesis 39:19, this week's Torah portion, and he left his garment in her hand, and he, vayanas, he fled. So what the Midrash is doing here is utilizing the Jewish hermeneutical principle we call Gezerah Shava. It's focusing on the verb vayanos. So here in Psalm 114 on the Hallel, it mentions there that the Yam Suf saw the actual bones of Yosef. And what did it do? It split. Okay, Hayam Ra'a Vayanos. Same thing. When Yosef was about to be tempted by the Eshet Potiphar, Potiphar's wife, he left his garment, Vayazov, in her hand, and Vayanas. He ran. He went against his nature. And so when we back up to the previous midrash, it says, well, the sea saw God. It was terrified. But here, this one says it saw Yosef. So how do we reconcile the two? Well, Yosef is an embodiment of the attribute of Yesod, which is an attribute of Hashem. It doesn't mean that he is God. It means that he possessed this divine attribute within him because he overcame his earthly ego, his earthly nature. Let me explain. It was only after Yosef overcame the temptation of Potiphar's wife that he becomes known as Yosef HaSadiq, Joseph the righteous. Now, this is based off of a verse we find in Mishli, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 25, that says, Sadiq Sod Olam, that a righteous person, a Sadiq, is literally the foundation of the world. Yesod can also be read as Sod, which means secret, the secret of the world. And also, Yesod is a foundation. It refers to a midah of Hashem. So in the Kabbalistic Sfirot, Yesod, okay, corresponds to the anatomy, the genitalia area of a male and female, the procreative faculties within man. So, but within the Sephardic tree, the Sfirot, we don't, the Sphirotic tree, we don't look at that literally, okay? The foundation of the world is first and foremost based on God's righteousness. Therefore, when a person ascends to the level of a Sadiq, and I'm not just talking about in religious terms like you see in Eretz Israel, you go around the street, oh, this is Rabbi so-and-so, this is so-and-so, Sadiq, and they're kissing fingers and kissing hands like it's the Jewish mafia. Oh, Sadiq, you know, his peyot is very long, you know, his kippah is very big. Oh, Sadiq Gamor, da-da-da. And by the way, I'm not trying to sound facetious and downplay anyone's, righteousness in that sense, but that doesn't encapsulate what a Sadiq is. Okay, anybody who ascends to a level of Sadiq, they are essentially eternalizing the midah of righteousness. They are emulating that attribute of Hashem. And once again, it does not mean that that person is literally God. Rather, they are embodying an attribute of God within them. Just like Abraham is identified with the Sphira of Chesed. Okay, he emulates the attribute of God's Chesed. Yitzhak was Givorah, Yaakov was Tiferet. Tiferet of the Pinimiyut, where Esav was of the Chisoniyut, till he completely tosses his spiritual calling out the window, per se. So when it comes to Yosef, Yosef embodies Yesod. Okay? How does one obtain this? They took their clothing off like Yosef did. He took his clothing off. We go back here to the rest of the Midrash. At the end, Vayazov bigdo. He left his garment, biyada, in her hand, vayanas. So when he takes the clothing off, it's a metaphor for taking off the carnal ego, the flesh. the physical makeup of a person, not literally the body, right? Take it off. Rather, they die to their self. It's a concept, bitul hayesh, nullification of self. When Yosef was 17 years old, he's working as a servant in Mitzrayim under Potiphar. And he's alone in Potiphar's house with Potiphar's wife. So according to Chazal, one of the Maimer Chazal is that Potiphar was married, but also he had a boyfriend. And it was common amongst many of the ancient societies in which powerful men, they would have homosexual relations, but they would also have a wife to procreate. And that's something that's a little bit more different in the political spectrum of today's alphabet community that's out there, whatever letter they're on today, in all due respect. The difference is with today, nothing's for the sake of procreation. Therefore, you have the push for transgenderism, right? Where back in the day, a person would have basically a boyfriend, but yet they would have a wife at home because they realized for their legacy to continue, their bloodline, they need to be able to procreate. So essentially, Potiphar's wife's at home. It was a pagan festival that day, and so time after time after time again, she attempted to seduce him. Okay? And so Chazal mentioned she went through tremendous effort to try to convince him, to try to get him to sleep with her. And so Yosef managed to withstand this temptation. Now, let's think about this. According to Derech Eretz, which is the natural way of the world, right? The natural way of man. It would have been impossible for a 17-year-old boy to reject the persistent advances of an attractive woman. Considering that Yosef was already betrayed by his brothers, sold into Mitzrayim, he's the only Hebrew kid that's down there. He has no way to connect himself back to his family. He doesn't know if they're alive. He doesn't know nothing. So he can consider himself a very lucky individual. He has been privileged and recognized to at least look over the affairs of Potiphar's home. And Potiphar's wife really likes him. And Potiphar has a boyfriend on the side, but Yosef can have, his wife on the side, right? And who knows, maybe one day Potiphar will pass away and then he could rise to the ranks of Potiphar, right? And still have Potiphar's wife. That's usually the natural thinking of some people. I'm not saying all, but that's how the ego thinks, how it operates. So here's Yosef, this 17-year-old Jewish kid, by himself in Mitzrayim, constantly being bombarded with sexual advancement day after day after day by this woman who is really beautiful according to Chazal. However, Yosef went against the natural order of his ego. He prevented himself from succumbing. And therefore, it was in the merit of Yosef who counteracted his natural impulse, his Yetzer Hara, that God then reciprocated, in which he counteracted nature when the sea split on behalf of Israel. And so when the Midrash mentions, and we'll go back to this right quick, in the first Midrash, by quoting Psalm 77, verse 17, that Ra'ulcha Ma'im Elokim, that the water saw you, O God, and they became terrified. But yet in the next Midrash, it says that they saw the Atzmot Yosef. And I mentioned which one is it? Did they see God? They see Yosef. Now, God is a corporal entity, so how did they perceive him? Obviously, nature can perceive things beyond our senses, as I mentioned earlier. Nature is more in tune with the Creator than most humans are. Well, because Yosef embodied the attribute of Yesod, that attribute of Hashem, it's as if they were seeing God. Now, not literal. Now, how can bones move a body of water? In Hebrew, the word atzmot, which I don't have on the screen, but if you can read Hebrew, bezuchut atzmotav, right? Atzmut there is the root word etzim. Etzim means essence. Okay? Essence. So the Yam, the sea, saw the essence of Yosef HaSadiq, who embodied the attribute of Yesod, the attribute of Hashem within him, because he went against his impulse when he was without any hope, when there was no guarantee that he would be successful in Mitzrayim, that he would ever see his family again. He went against all of that by having trust in Hashem and faith. And because of that, because he fled, the Midrash quotes the Hallel. It says, Hayam ra'av hayanos. The sea split. Yosef embodied in his essence the attribute of Hashem. Now, I'll challenge you. If you want to try this, go to your local body of water, whether you live in the Atlantic, Pacific, or whatever ocean you live in, the Gulf, a lake, whatever, and ask it to see if it'll split for you. Because the Torah says that the Yam did not even split from Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Remember, the Torah says Moshe is crying out to Hashem. Hashem's like, what are you crying to me for? Just go. It wasn't until the Atzmot Yosef came. And that's when Nachshon ben Aminadav drew upon that narrative of faith. He jumped in and the Yam split. It's not in nature's nature to go against itself. And so, really what the moral of the Midrash is teaching is that because Yosef went against his nature, against his flesh, and because he did not transgress, he did not sin, vayanas vayitze hachutza, he fled and went outside. He took off his garment. He took off his ego, which is contrary to human nature. Nature, in return, bowed. It removed its own nature and allowed Israel to cross. And this is the same thing that is consistent with anybody on any level of the world. Nature will yield to a person when they are aligned with Hashem, when they are emulating the attributes of God. Commenting further upon this, I'd like to delineate here to the Zohar in this week's Torah portion, in which it elaborates and sheds profound insight. And here the Zohar says, happy is he whose deeds are good, who keeps his ways so that the Yetzer Hara shall not be attached to him, as is written here in Genesis 39, verse 10. And it came to pass as she spoke to Yosef, Yom Yom, day by day, but Yom Yom could also mean every second of the day. This chick was persistent and trying to have relations with him. It says that he did not listen to her. And so it says he did not listen to what she said to him daily as the spirit of defilement. It's a ruach tumah. And tumah in Hebrew is not just impure, but it's a form of energy that you cannot detect in a laboratory, And therefore the spirit of defilement, which is the Yetzer Hara, seduces man every day, saying, Leshikav, to lie with me. Where? Go Gehinom, in Gehinom. And thus be sentenced there to be with her. So here the Zohar saying is that the narrative of Eshi Potiphar, the story of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, is not just a narrative of once upon a time ago, but it's also an allegory of the Yetzer Hara that tries to get us to be seduced, to follow this, to follow that, ultimately to drag us with the form of impure energy called Tumah, forfeiting our divine calling in this world. Zohar then goes on to say afterwards, come and behold, when a man cleaves to that side, and that side is the Sitra Achra, the other side, the dark side, the impure side, he's drawn after it. He defiles himself with it in this world and in the next. And once again, Tumah is impervious to our physical senses. So I was talking about certain things about sounds and sight, okay? Tumah is something that is way beyond the spectrum of light and sound that exists in the higher spiritual realms. It's a form of impure energy that a person can contract, an STD, spiritually transmitted disease, and a person could be completely oblivious of it, and it is attached to them. It's a form of energy that goes with them here and in the next world. Come and behold, the Zohar says, the side of Tumah, of impurity, is dirty and filthy, as is written in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 22. It says, you shall say to it, therefore go hence, say tomar lo, is what it says in the Hebrew. So here the Zohar is saying the word say, Sadi Aleph, say tomar lo, should be understood as zo'ah mamash. Zo'ah means excrement. And therefore, and with excrement, we proclaim that whoever turns from the ways of the Torah is condemned to excrement, to zo'ah. to which were sentenced all the wicked people in the world who had no emunah, no faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. So here the Zohar is saying is that whenever the Yetzer Hara tries to get a person to speak, okay, it's trying to get them to be filled with defilement, excrement, okay? It's trying to actually sully their soul. Zohar then goes on to say, when it sees no one standing against it, it is the way of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, to wage war with it immediately. She caught him by the garment, quoting from the Torah, saying over there, Shichva imi, lie with me, sleep with me. She caught him by his garment. Why? Because when the Yetzer Hara obtains mastery over a man, it first adorns and mends his clothing and curls his hair, meaning a person is always fixated with the physical realm, their ego and their identity and their their stature in this world. So it says, it's written, she caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me, cleave to me. Because that's what the Yetzer Hara does. It distracts a person, blindside them, and therefore that's how it attaches onto them like a leech. Zohar then goes on to conclude, the righteous, however, stands against it and engages in war against him. Why? Because it's a war against principalities. It's not a war against flesh and blood. It's a principality. It's something spiritual that transcends the body. It is written over here, once again in the Torah, Genesis 39, verse 12, that says over here, Vaya'azov bigdo biyada vayanas vayetza hachutza. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. He shall leave it, be strong against it, flee it and escape it, so that it will have no power over him. So let me translate that in modern terms. The Yetzer Hara that pulls us, it could be many things. It could be a physical person, a man or a woman. A person could be in a compromised situation where they may want to commit adultery, or just have some type of, affair with somebody, right? It could be the pursuit of money, notoriety. It could be the pursuit of technology. I got to get the latest cell phone. I got to get the earbuds that come with it. I got to get this. I got to get that, right? I got to get all these things. But when a person lets go of the shtuyot, they leave it in the hand of the inclinations, the impulse, the desire. They leave it. They remove that from them and they flee outside. This no longer has the phone, the car, the money, the desire no longer has a power over them. Because they're not going to wage war with their impulse in the physical. They'll lose all the time. You'll lose 100% of the time against your Yetzer Hara when you attempt to go to war with it in some type of physical way. It's spiritual. It's a principality. You're dealing with principality, higher forces, and therefore you have to be able to let go. Take the garment off, figuratively speaking, and flee. Run. Run. Whatever causes you to stumble, remove it out of your life. And so when we come back to the Midrash, which I quoted from earlier, when we take a look at this entire scenario in the Torah, and I mentioned, why is it that God is silent, right? He's not intervening. He doesn't speak to Yaakov in a dream, a vision. He doesn't show up warning Yaakov's children that if you don't stop with your conspiring plans against your younger brother Yosef, we're going to smack you around. Nothing. We ask why God is quiet. And yet the Midrash told us something fascinating, that while Yosef, Ruvain, and Yaakov are all mourning, and Yehuda is busy finding a wife because of his remorse, it mentions that there, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One, blessed be He, Osek Bore Oro Shel Melech HaMashiach, was occupied in creating the light of King Mashiach. In other words, what we learn from this Torah portion and this lesson here is that when Hashem is going to put us in a tribulation, He's already provided the remedy. And so we know later on when Yosef confronts his brothers that he tells them, what you intended for evil, God intended for good, right? This is Hashem engineered this entire event. And the same thing with us. When we look at it from the perspective of being in the tribulation, we can't really understand how it's to our good, but only when we get to the other side, outside of the tunnel, when we get into the light, we can see that this was good. This was from Hashem. So when we look at these events, we have to understand that everything Hashem is doing is creating the light of Mashiach, right? Now, it doesn't say he's creating Mashiach. We're not talking the pre-existence of a divine Mashiach being. We're not talking theology here. That's not what the Midrash is saying. The Midrash is trying to tell us that in our ordeals, in our trials, our struggles, our afflictions, Hashem is creating the light of Mashiach. Mashiach is a level of consciousness, not just limited to an individual. We're not worshiping a Superman figure here. And once again, we look at Yehuda, right? Yehuda did something very treacherous against his youngest brother, against his father. And because of his remorse and his depression, he went and took a wife amongst the Canaanites, something the Torah told the descendants of Abraham, don't do. He went there and realizing, okay, these sons I had, they're spiritually on a lower level, meaning they don't have the vessel to contain the divine spark of the mission of the children of Abraham. So Hashem permits Yehuda to have relations with his daughter-in-law. That is the God of Israel. That's how the God of Israel works. That's contrary to most people's understanding of perfection and righteousness. It goes back to a lesson I taught that Chazal mentioned Hashem found the spark of Mashiach in Sodom with Lot and his two daughters. Through incestuous relations gave birth to who? The people of Moab and Ammon. So here Yehuda has relations with his daughter-in-law. And the consequence of that, the result of that, is the birth of twins, Zerach and Peretz. It's the line of Peretz, when you go into the future, that Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth, the descendant of Moab, who came into existence from an incestuous relation, marries in with this individual named Boaz and gives birth to the line of the Mashiach, the Davidic dynasty. And so we see that in this tragic situation, this tribulation, Hashem is creating the light of King Messiah through our transgressions. And so one of the things that a person should be optimistic and grateful for is that whatever you may be going through, that Hashem is creating the light of Mashiach from your circumstance, whether that's on an individual level or a collective level for Am Israel. Therefore, the end result of this is Messianic consciousness, what we call Melech HaMashiach. And I know we all have a theological indifference about what we think of that, but that's from the Kabbalistic perspective. The metaphysical understanding is about the end goal, is to have the higher consciousness. As I explained before, everything that was created in the beginning was there. The Or HaGanaz, the primordial light. We could see everything if we weren't limited to our senses and this body. We would see the bigger picture. Meaning that also if you step outside of space and time, you see how everything works out for the good of God. Everything works out. And so you limit it through senses and through limitations because you can't perceive those things. So in this situation, while we're going through our trials and our drama, trying to figure out how to do this and how to do that, God is preoccupied in the background with creating the light of King Mashiach from out of our trials and tribulations. That is the moral of the story of what this week's Torah portion is teaching us. Is that God is silent? Yes, God is silent many times. He doesn't always speak. I mean, even like in the case of the prophets, you take a look at each of the prophets who were also priests, they were Kohanim. Ezekiel, for example, he did not receive any communication with Hashem until his 5th year in exile. 5 years into exile is finally when he receives communication from Hashem and this great revelation that we call the Maseh Merkava, which deals with the secret of the chariot. And so it's fascinating how God works. And even with the situation with Yehuda and Tamar, the beginning of that, to remedy the situation with what happened with Yosef and the betrayal of Yaakov, was to sow a spark of Messiah, which would then come to fruition in the days of Boaz with Ruth. That Ruth's conversion creates the Davidic dynasty. That's the mind-blowing thing. But you can have a Ruth. You couldn't have a Yeshaya, David HaMelech, without the situation with Lot and his two daughters that escaped Sodom, right? You couldn't have it. None of that would be possible if those events were not engineered by God. And if you want more on that, then I highly would advise you go take a look at my teaching on Parashat Vayeishev, in which I cover that topic there to talk about the birth of the Messiah, the origins of it back there in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring me to an end for my teaching on Parashat Vayeishev. And once again, if our organization is a blessing to you, you'd like to support us, you can find a link to support directly below the video's description. We want to thank everybody in advance for the support and their prayers. And if you have any questions pertaining to this Torah teaching, please send me an email, rabbi@70facesoftorah.com. I do respond to those in the order they arrive in. Or we have the comment section on YouTube. I don't have time to go through. In fact, we have a team of moderators that deal with our comment section, everything. So I don't have the means at the time to respond to comments. But if you want to sincerely communicate with me, you can send me an email regarding the Torah portion. So until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and